Martin Walker. I'm from Deloitte in Sweden. You probably can't tell from my strong Swedish accent, but been in the UK, been in Sweden for the last 2 years. I lead our technology advisory practice over here, but still linked in with our European sourcing and technology advisory practice. So we specialize in helping clients from sourcing strategy through to doing the deal and transition and the whole operating model design. So what I'm going to do today is to share with you some of our points of view on multi-sourcing and how you actually govern and make multi-sourcing work. So I think hopefully it's going to build on from some of the conversations that have begun earlier in the day. So 3 key questions to cover. What is it? I'm not going to try and teach you to suck eggs. I'll give you a quick overview as to where we've come from. How can we make multi-sourcing effective? Thinking largely from a what do we need to do when contracting and going through the planning process. And then we'll move on to what are the consequences of multi-sourcing. So what do you need to get in place from a capability and operating model perspective? So what is multi-sourcing? If we start off and look back, 15, 20 years ago when sort of outsourcing started, a lot of big deals happened, single provider model. In Sweden, you've got the Nordic processor deal. In the UK, you have some very large public sector deals. I personally worked on one of them as they were unraveling it, trying to move to a multi-sourcing deal. But one deal, for example, was worth over £11 billion over 7 years. So there was phenomenal large deals as organisations were trying to say, IT, don't really understand it, let's try and give it away to someone else who does. Then what happened is organisations started saying, well, this one service provider can't give me everything I need. So they started inadvertently getting into multi-sourcing arrangements, especially as you get cloud application service providers out there. They go in and bring in these other service providers and say, well, how are we going to all make that work? So you end up with multi-service provider by stealth. And then we're getting to the 4th generation type deals where we're talking about service integration in a multi-service environment. So that's where clients are physically thinking about, how do I put that integration layer in between my different service providers so I can deliver true end-to-end service to the business from different providers? And we'll get on to more of the last one as we go through the presentation. So again, what is multi-sourcing? Traditionally, you can look at vertical integration, where you take a functional approach to things. So I'm going to go and get my mainframe from Volvo IT. I'm going to get my servers from IBM or Accenture. I'm going to get my end-user computing from Tieto, and so the list goes on. Or we can take a horizontal approach, where I go and get all my infrastructure and data center from one provider. I may have got a core insurance system or a core banking system from a second provider, and we may even have outsourced HR and bought in a complete managed service, which includes the BPO and the IT. So somehow we need to manage this environment from an IT perspective. How would we do that? So it's all a bit complicated. Why do organizations typically go for a multi-sourcing environment? We did a client survey recently. Single biggest reason is no one single vendor can deliver everything that we need. Second one is to mitigate risk. We don't want to be at the behest of one single provider who has the opportunity to charge us what they want, when they want, and we turn over and say, thank you very much, Mr. Provider, I'll pay you the bill. I've worked personally for both providers and clients, so I find it quite interesting when I put my supplier hat on when I go and talk to a client and just recall an occasion where it was a managed network contract for the National Health Service. So it's providing about 80% of network services into the NHS in the UK, which is, I think, the largest UK employer. And a bill would come in, or a bill would be sent out by the service provider, and it would get paid. No inventory, nothing. It would just get paid. It was marvelous. And then all of a sudden, a transformation program came in, and the client started asking what's the bill for, and looking to say, well, you've transformed this and you're still charging me the same for the legacy circuits. How does that work? And so it really is amazing. Again, service providers are there to make money, and you need to be aware to that. They are commercial organisations, right, like your organisation. So you need to be careful that you're not being held to ransom. So what are some of the challenges with a multi-sourcing environment? Well, clearly, you want to deliver end-to-end service to your customers in the business. And if you're in a multi-service environment, you're going to have different components involved in delivering that service. So unless you manage it rigidly, then you risk things falling through the gap. So who's actually responsible for making sure that the network, the server, and the application are all up at the right time, and that if one goes down, that the other two parties can do their bit to make sure we can get it up and running again. And of course, there's finger pointing. I'm not going to let you touch my Active Directory. So how do you actually get the vendors to really work together? And of course, there's internal people as well. It's very easy to blame the service provider when somebody internally hasn't done their job. So how do we balance all of this and make sure that we get rid of some of this finger pointing? And possibility of unhealthy competition. Again, service providers, you've got a contract with them, and you may be thinking, they risk pulling the plug. If I don't sign up again, how am I going to make sure that I get the A team? How am I going to make sure that they don't decide to turn off all the services if I don't re-sign for another 5 years? So you need to think about how do you avoid or mitigate having the risk of one dominant service provider who can essentially make the other service providers look bad, which, if they're providing that integration layer, is quite easy to do. And intellectual property. Again, on one of the large deals I worked on in the UK, the service integrator provider and the host of the Active Directory would not let the network provider have access to the Active Directory. And the network provider wanted it because they'd been contractually obliged to provide a BlackBerry service. But the service integration provider was saying, actually, Mr. Client, we've got a really good PDA service that we can sell you. So on one side, they're trying to sell a new service. On the other side, they're saying, but you can't have access to the Active Directory because of security reasons. And at the same time, bad luck, Mr. Network Provider, you can't deliver the BlackBerry service. Don't you look bad? So you've got to think about how you're going to get all these different moving parts working. So how can I make multi-sourcing effective? The thing we need to think about is when you're starting your sourcing strategy, you need to be thinking about your overall operating model. You need to be thinking about how all of these things are actually going to work in real life before you go out and say, I want to buy a new data center service or I want to buy a new network service. You need to be thinking end-to-end service when you start that sourcing strategy. Now, if you've already got some contracts that are not due to terminate for another 3 or 4 years, you still have options. One of them could be that you renegotiate. Another one is you could pull the plug and say, well, we're going to have to absorb the cost. Another one is we factor in 3 years' time, we're going to change the operating model to operating model part 2. So there are a number of things to think about, but you've got to start off with that target operating model. And starting off is around thinking about some of the principles that you want to have with that operating model and how you want the vendors to behave. And you need to bake some of those principles into your contracts. If they're not in the contracts, they don't have teeth. If they're not in the contracts, then they could say, yes, of course I'll do that, Mr. Client, and then they'll do the opposite. Second area, you need to think about what are the different components of your contract that describes how the operating model is going to work, how you're going to govern the agreement, and again, how you want the different parties to work together. Thirdly, we've called this thing co-opetition. So combination of cooperation and competition. Again, these guys are in it to make money. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're all here to make money. But what we need to do is we get the best out of them working together so they can make money, but not at the expense of you. So how do we get them to, so they've got a good carrot there to help them excel, but at the same time they excel in the interests of you rather than just them. And then the fourth area is making sure that we have some common structured processes and forums. So you don't just sit down with supplier 1 here and have a chat about issues and problems, and then supplier 2 and supplier 3. You bring them together in joint forums, and you get them to start saying, we have had a fault with our ERP system, it has gone down, and it's been a combination of end-user computing, network, and application. You guys sit together, work out what the problem was, and make sure it doesn't happen again. How do you make sure that you get that sort of behavior built in so they're always working together to come up with the answers for you, rather than you're dealing with them one by one and they're all finger pointing at each other? Yes. Very much so. You need to build all of this into those support agreements, into those contracts. So back to the operating model piece, you need to think, what are those governance forums where you bring all of those different parties together and you make them obliged to work together? And I'll get on to some of the details of how to do that. So yeah, agree with you completely. And the second component is you need to recognize that you need to have service integration. And one of the things that that you'll get to is, do we have service integration retained in our organization? So do we install all the service management tools and processes, or do we outsource it to a third party? And legacy, a lot of outsourcing to a third party. We're now seeing a lot of that brought back in-house now, where organizations are realizing that the service integration is the crown jewels. It is where it all happens. If you don't have access to your CMDB, and you don't know what assets you've got, then one, you're going to really struggle to manage your provider, and two, you're going to really struggle when it comes to contract renegotiation about knowing what you have and what services you want. So you need to make sure that you align your supplier incentives and expectations for end-to-end service delivery and bake it into the contract, i.e. give it teeth. So example principles, I don't propose I go into these, but again, the principle is that you want to set out at the early stages of the procurement of how you want this multi-supplier environment to work. And you need to get to make sure that the suppliers that you're choosing are ready to buy into those principles. And the best way to buy into them is to get them baked into the contract. In your heads of agreement or in your master services agreement, you should get principles such as this built in. Because then when it comes to a dispute, or if it comes to a dispute later, down to one provider's not playing ball, then you've got something to go back to that says, from a legal perspective, we outlined the principles of the contract, and therefore you've got a lot stronger leg to stand on than if you get to the stage where you say, well, we had an agreement, and they go, legally, where is the agreement? So make sure you get these principles baked into your contract. You need to make sure that you've got the right components of your contract in place. So you start off with your master services agreement at the top, and then you're going to have a number of schedules. Make sure in your schedules you describe how governance is going to work, what those key roles and responsibilities are. Describe from a cross-functional perspective, how is problem and change management going to exist, and how do you want those vendors to cooperate? So don't bring this in later, get it in up front. Do that target operating model design up front before you start the sourcing process or as part of the sourcing process. The number of clients I've been to who've put the last 10 minutes of effort into creating this as an afterthought, where they've spent all their time defining the individual tower SLAs, is very, very high. Remember, these documents are living, breathing documents. So they can be updated as you go. So you shouldn't just confine them to the drawer after you've signed the deal. Make sure you keep them updated and they become the master reference for you and your suppliers. You You should also think about gain sharing and incentive clauses and customer satisfaction. So again, tying back to the business strategy around what's your customer actually getting out of all of this. So it's not just at a unit technology level. Again, you're tying it back to end-to-end service. So what we see and kind of what we're helping a lot of our clients with at the moment is structuring the agreement so you have a number of different service levels. So your traditional service level is at a component level, so 5 nines availability on the network or on the data center or whatever component. Then you're going to have OLAs between your different service providers. But then what we're doing now is helping clients putting SLAs, which is obviously between you and the service provider, around the service provider's compliance to those OLAs. So again, it gives it a bit more teeth. Then we have end-to-end SLAs based on an individual business service. And then we get to sort of collaborative processes, so having SLAs around your customer sat and around ability for effective problem management and effective incident management and change management. So thinking about, again, how do all of your services come together? And at a macro level, how well is our service provider performing? So how could that collaborative framework look like in principle? Well, you're going to have your individual service providers, and of course, you may have got services still being provided internally. So you need to think about those internal providers almost as an external provider and still have the same sort of SLA, OLA regime in place with them, as well as at an integration layer. And then we have this thing called sort of the pain share mechanism, risk at pool. So what we look about doing is then, well, there's a bonus at the end of the year or the end of the quarter that we're going to share amongst our service providers. And if you deliver to a certain end-to-end level, then you're going to get a share of that bonus. So again, giving them a carrot to work with as well as the SLA stick. So, but if there's a problem, we look at what's the, we do some root cause analysis, and typically we would manage the process, the client, but then you're going to have to get involvement from the different service providers in that root cause analysis. And then you can identify who's going to have the service credit, who's going to be hit by the service credit. If you can't find an attributable fault, then they all lose out. So again, what you're trying to do is to encourage them to work together to get kind of that end-to-end service working. And then, again, what we'd be looking to have is, behind all of this, some forum where you have joint problem management, joint issue management forum, where they get together and proactively try and plan to improve the overall service, so then they have less outage, and therefore they get a greater share of the pot at the end of it. So we then get to the system integration role. And as I said earlier, we're seeing a lot more organizations bringing the service integration back in-house. There's kind of the big challenge where you have obviously handed over to your service provider is, one is around how do you know you're being charged correctly, and how do you know that you've got the right assets and whether they're being effectively utilized. But secondly, when it comes to renegotiation, how are you going to get all of that data back? How are you going to give the other service providers an equal chance when it comes to competing for a network tower or a desktop tower or whatever else if you don't know what you've got? So you need to think about how can we have more control of our data, and how can we manage some of these kind of the ITSM processes ourselves, and sort of reduce our dependency on those on the outsourced supplier. So what are the consequences of multi-sourcing? Yeah, sure.
If you are outsourcing and it takes some time, then you're outsourcing again. When you're outsourcing and you're outsourcing after a year or two, I mean, it's a continuous process. You outsource service domain A, then B, then C. How could I construct a collaborative framework and antedate it, meaning including the first outsourced part into this collaborative framework? Is that a new contract, or could you give an advice?
It depends on kind of what's in your current contracts, to be honest, and how much room you've got to negotiate. I've looked at some contracts where the service provider has put some really, really nasty kind of termination clauses in, where you can be liable to some huge sums of money if you terminate at that point, through to some which are very client favourable, where you've got the opportunity to renegotiate. The general rule is service providers are not unreasonable. They are out, they want to do a good job for you, and they want to make money at the same time. So if there's a way that you can make their life easier and your life better at the same time, there's usually a way that you can sit down with them and have that renegotiation conversation. I mentioned previously I led the network transformation for the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK, which was the largest managed network contract in Europe at the time. And what had happened there is they had two dominant providers, EDS and BT. And each of them were worth in the kind of the tens of billions of pounds, each of the contracts. They essentially, the DWP sat down with the two providers and said, this isn't working, we need to do something about it. And they defined the new target operating model with a service integration layer, moving to a tower-based model, and they renegotiated the contracts. So EDS ended up having 4 towers, BT had 1, and then they could interchange ADAM providers kind of quite easily. And what that enabled them to do was then 4 years later, when the contracts moved to termination date, they had the ability to bring in alternative tower providers into that new operating model. So it really depends on kind of how burdened you are with your existing contracts, but usually service providers are open to negotiate, providing there's something in it for them. And again, if that's just making their life easier, then they're probably up for it as well. So it's a very personal issue as to where you are, but you can do it. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. So, what are the consequences of multi-sourcing? The key is around service integration, which I think I've probably sort of tried to reinforce as part of this presentation. Your role is, or you need a function there to integrate all of the services. And using the DWP model, it was interesting because they actually tried to outsource part of that. And it became quite painful. And the reason it became painful is because one is you had one dominant service provider in there, and two is you were managing every single request that came in, there was a cost associated with it, and you got down to this really minutiae level of sort of cost management that got quite painful. So we're certainly seeing a lot more organisations sort of moving away from that. Let's outsource the integration area, and again, let's bring it in-house. But it is a lot down to capabilities as well. Yeah.
To some level that already exists, because I guess in a true project you have like hundreds of suppliers.
Yep.
And some of them second-tier one are actually managed by the individual suppliers.
Yeah.
So in reality, if you go into the details, that already exists within.
You're right. I guess there are two layers. There's within your IT function, as we said earlier, there's already a lot of service integration going on as you're buying cloud-based services or ISP. So that happens. How well it happens is another story. And then if you prime from a vendor, quite likely they're going to subcontract in services from other providers. They have to do that anyway as well. So you're right. It's already there. It's recognizing that this is a key capability that you need to put in place to make multi-sourcing work effectively. So we, like Gartner, have our view of the world as to what effective IT looks like. And similar to Gartner, we have plan, build, transition, run, manage vendors, manage and control, manage customers. And the key point of this is that service integration management and multi-sourcing is going to impact all areas, whether it be the enterprise architecture over here, as Gartner talked about, or whether it be down to the core ITIL type processes, which are more obvious, and how do you manage incident, problem, change, etc. And then you have your actually how we're going to manage our vendors at a strategic level in the middle here. So we use this as a starting point when doing an assessment to say, so what is going to change? What capabilities do we need in-house to manage this? Where are we going to buy in the capabilities to support that from our outsourced providers? So what are the key building blocks for service integration management? Well, we have the program management, which is around making sure that you manage the overall portfolio and sort of all around the plan area. So how do we make sure that we're spending the money on the right things and making sure that our suppliers are delivering what they should be delivering? We have service management, which is focusing very much on those end-to-end services, and again, kind of really around those traditional ITIL processes, so incident, problem, change, asset management, making sure our service providers are working together and doing what they should be doing in accordance with the contract and the spirit of the contract. And again, I think that's quite important. It's the spirit of the contract, not just the letter of the contract. Back to those principles that I mentioned earlier. We have the governance. So we get about making sure we've got those right forums in place, the right management information coming in place, and again, very much cross-service provider. Clearly there's a place for governance forum where you have one-to-one meetings with individual suppliers, but where possible thinking about how do we bring all of those different suppliers that contribute to delivering end-to-end service together in a room to improve the overall quality. We have quality and compliance. So thinking around how do we, kind of what are our quality standards, what do we expect from our suppliers? And then innovation management, so how do we get our suppliers to help deliver innovation and continuous improvement? So again, I've spoken to a lot of people and they say, yeah, innovation, it's all a bit fluffy and woolly, isn't it? But what we're really talking about here is back to that sort of once a year or a couple of times a year when you're looking at your overall strategy, getting the vendors in and getting them to help you with, well, what is the latest and greatest at the moment? So you can be informed around continuous performance improvements, going to your vendors and getting them to say, well, if so-and-so does something differently, then we can improve the overall service for you. So getting them to take some responsibility for that overall innovation. So what are the benefits of service integration management? Clearly without it, we end up ending in quite a high cost situation, revenue leaks, we end up with very silo-based technical delivery as opposed to end-to-end service delivery. We have complexities with the delivery because people don't necessarily understand the handoffs, whether that be internally or between service providers. And you also get a lot of this finger pointing. And you can put so much in a contract, but a lot of it comes down to actions. How do you sit down with these people, get them feeling confident, get them working with each other to make sure you get that sort of end-to-end delivery? Some very simple techniques, co-location. Put your service tower leads from the different providers in a room together and give them the desk there so they get to speak to each other rather than accepting one's over here, one's over there, and in different parts of the organisation. Kind of think about your office plan. Little subtle things can make quite a difference. What are the benefits? Hopefully you can get good alignment because you can focus your efforts on sort of the business management and working with the business to come up with the next set of services and delivering high quality service rather than fighting with your service providers to get them to work together. Quality. Again, you're looking for them to come up with the problem management. Yes, you're sitting on top of it with a big accountability, but you're looking for them to continually performance improve, to improve quality over time. And this focus on innovation, continuous improvement. So again, understand where you are today, really baseline it, and then set them targets about where you want to get to, and focus in so it's one of those core principles that we will continually improve. Just accepting the as is not acceptable. So, just some closing thoughts then. So multi-sourcing, I think you can look at it as being inevitable now. It's very difficult to move away from multi-sourcing in some shape or form. And these challenges that we've talked about aren't going to go away. Think end-to-end service. It's very tempting to go off and think, our network contract's coming up for renewal, we need to go and retender that. Our data center's coming up to retender that. Think about overall, what is our customer expecting from us? How do we kind of come up with a sourcing strategy that looks from a service-based view of the world rather than a technology-based view? And yes, sure, you may go off and procure data center, network, end-user computing from 3 different providers, but do it in the context of end-to-end service. Define how service integration management is going to work kind of as part of the procurement exercise, as part of the sourcing strategy. Don't leave it till afterwards. Number of clients who they've outsourced it and then they say, right, how's this going to work then? You've got to invest up front. It'll be worth every penny of it. And make sure that you put those key principles into your contracts. So again, so everyone understands that, again, the vendors want to know what you're trying to get out of this. They want to know what kind of organization you're wanting to create. So I may have painted them as being these evil creatures out there, but they're not. They want the best for you in most cases. So tell them what you want them to do. Be prescriptive and get those in the contracts. And then make sure you've got the right capabilities in place. If you're outsourcing for the first time, you may not have got those capabilities at the moment. Kind of people are moving from I'm programming in Java one day through to I need to manage a contract where I've got a load of people who are programming Java for me. They're desperate to get into the detail and to understand what's going on in the Java code. You've got to try and raise that capability level and think about IT as being a management function. And I think probably the most important one here is think exit before you begin. Again, we think about outsourcing as being a bit like entering a marriage. The difference is you need your prenup agreement. So you need to think about sort of like our Greek friends with the euro. They didn't really think about how they're going to get out if it didn't work. Make sure you don't make the same mistake.